All right, this chapter is about Charles A. McGough Sr., my grandfather, subtitled The Beginning of the Value System. So my grandfather was born sometime in the 1880s, maybe 1881, 82, and he died in 1962. So he lived about 81 years, more or less. So he was born in Philadelphia. There's not a lot about the story, so most of what I'm going to tell you is things my father repeated to me, which means that they're probably close to accurate with a bit of embellishment, knowing my dad. My grandfather had 4 brothers. Billy and John are the names Dad mentioned most. I don't know the names of the other 2, but they're all McGough in Philadelphia. Billy was the youngest, and Dad seemed to like him a lot, but I have the impression that he was also an alcoholic that Grandpa had to take care of. So I'm not sure the early days. At some point, his father died or left or something, and his mother, whose name was Mary, if I remember, took up with a man named Taylor. So Dad grew up and calling him Daddy Taylor. Now, I don't know much about all that, so it's up to Carolyn to figure it out on Ancestry.com. But my grandfather must have had a job, must have been working around Philadelphia somewhere. Somewhere along the line, in the early 1900s, maybe 1904, 1905, there was a streetcar strike in Philadelphia. And the streetcars, used to run everything. That's how deliveries were made of newspapers and vegetables and all of those things. So when the streetcar strike came, the newspaper couldn't get delivered, which is actually kind of important in those days. It was the only way to share news, and it was delivered several times a day, the morning, the afternoon, the evening editions. So my grandfather went to one of the newspapers, I don't remember if it was the Inquirer or the Bulletin, and made a deal with the circulation manager, Colonel somebody, I don't know, that he would deliver the newspapers. And he got the contract on the condition that he actually made it happen. Now, according to my dad, the story is that my grandfather then loaded 2 wagons. The first wagon with newspapers and the second wagon with a bunch of his tough friends from South Philly, Irish guys. So they would start delivering the newspapers. If the strikers tried to stop them, the guys in the second wagon would get out and have a discussion with them, at which point the wagons would then be allowed to continue on. Because he successfully delivered, he kept the contract for a long, long time. And that was kind of the basis. He got the money for the wagons and the horses. He borrowed it from an aunt. Throughout our history, there's always these stories of people borrowing money from some aunt. So the news is that the men have no money, but the aunts seem to always have a few bucks because it comes up again and again here or even on Mom's side of the story. So once he got established as a business, he was a teamster, which means that he had horses and he rented out teams of horses. So in addition to any contracts he had for contracting or hauling or so on, if you wanted to pick up vegetables at the harbor and you take them someplace, or if you needed horses to pull construction vehicles, then you'd come to Charlie and you'd rent his teams of horses. Their stable was on 2025-31 Reed Street. And this is Granddad's advertising calendar from 1925 that my father, of course, kept, and then we had framed. So he's a bit of an entrepreneurial guy, teams and horses to hire, newspaper deliveries, contracting teamster. The business must have been relatively successful because my father went to St. Joe's Prep in the 20s and then went to Villanova in the 30s. So somehow there was enough money to pay that. There's a lot of pictures of my granddad and grandmom at very black tie, white tie dinners in Philadelphia. So he must have been, a bit of a successful businessman all through those first 20, 30 years. The story is he got to know my grandmother because she worked in her father's store. They had a little storefront down in some neighborhood in Philadelphia. And he'd go in there and got to know her and chat up with her because he was friends with one of her brothers. So he decided that he wanted to marry Carrie. He just thought she was full of life and be great and terrific. Her brothers tried to talk him out of it. because they knew her very well. But he just was in love with her. So they got married. This is a picture of them on their honeymoon. The only night that he ever spent away from the horses in the stable, because he's always running the business. Later on in life, grandmother, when she moved to Hanover, then painted this picture based on that little photograph of the two of them in Atlantic City on their honeymoon night, sitting on the shore. So this is how people went to the shore. A little bit different than today. So that is tied to that. This chair is supposedly a wedding gift that my grandmother received at her wedding in 1905 or 1906, whenever it was. They were probably a pretty successful company partnership, because according to my dad, grandmother kind of kept the books, and she was kind of a forceful person. So I'm sure she kind of drove some of the business and practical aspects of their life. My dad tells the story of the house was right in the stable and had one of those kitchen doors with two halves. So there's no air conditioning, so she'd leave the top half open. And every once in a while, of course, a horse would wander over and poke his head in to see what was cooking in the kitchen, and she would just shoo him away. Dad grew up in the stables. He learned to ride. He had a pony when he was young. He had friends from some of the stable workers. There was a little African-American boy whose nickname was Snowball. I don't know why, but that was one of Dad's childhood companions. So you have this image of a very kind of stable, young, prosperous family in South Philadelphia. There's not a lot of interim stories there. My grandfather must have been a really reliable person, because, and this is a whole different story, but my grandmother had a sister who apparently was really challenging, and she was a secretary, and I'll tell more about this in the other chapter. But she got married, had some money, ended up for some reason that was never clear to me in a convent, kind of as a retreat person, and the convent kicked her out. I guess she was just too forceful or something like that. So who went to pick her up? It was Charlie. When my grandmother's mother was very sick and dying, she was in the hospital. This, I don't know when it was late 30s or early 40s. And she wanted to get out of the hospital, because in those days, the hospital was the place you went to die. So people were fussing around her, her family's fussing around her. And she just looked my grandfather, Charlie, in the eye and said, "Charlie, get me out of here," which of course he did. So when you have this image of a person who's very responsible, a person who is really dedicated to his business, dedicated to his family, dedicated to doing what was, expected of him. My mother's family, who didn't like my grandmother, always said that what they knew of Charlie, that he was a very, very likable guy, easy to get along with, not a big talker, but he was a doer. So obviously, as you would expect, somewhere in the 30s, 40s, trucks are coming in. And this is, my grandfather's kind of, I guess, romantic nature. Instead of switching from horses to trucks, he never did. He stayed with his horses all through the 30s and 40s. And of course, it was not untenable anymore. People weren't running horses through central Philadelphia. They all had trucks. And if he'd switched over, it would be a whole different career as a teamster. But I have the impression from reading some of my dad's papers and some stories that the business got into some trouble, started owing people money. There wasn't enough contracting to pay the bills. So sometime around 1944, 1945, they had to sell the business, and Grandpa and Grandmother moved out to Hanover. And my dad had something to do with cleaning it up. They sold the land. We went down to see the space one time in the 60s. And my dad is driving one of his big black Cadillacs through South Philadelphia, narrow streets. Sometime Google the address, and you'll see it's, even today, not the most prosperous neighborhood. But in the 60s, we're driving through, and my mom's punching the lock button over and over and over on the car, because the buildings, people are just sitting on them. It was obviously a poor neighborhood. One building we passed had the whole face of it blown out, so you could see all the rooms inside. And I believe that on the corner in those days, there was a church. So there's no remnants of the stable left. If you do Google Earth, you'll just see kind of a warehouse building there. Charlie apparently was a relatively good religious guy. He was a member of St. Joe's, the old St. Joe's Church in downtown Philadelphia. And Dad talked about, things that they would do, being baptized and first confirmation and all that stuff. So when they moved out here, he didn't have much to do. The house we lived in was about 2 miles from downtown. And there was a little trolley and a streetcar. So he'd get up every day and he'd wander in and take the streetcar into town, go to the barber shop, have a coffee or something. He was not a drinker, and that probably had to do with his Uncle Billy, or Dad's Uncle Billy. So when my mom married him, they by now it's late 50s, early 60s, and she moved in, and she just adored Charlie. She just thought he was a really good man, which tells you a lot about Charlie, because my mom could tell you exactly what she thought of anybody. So they were sitting there one night with Dad and Mom and Grandma all having a Manhattan or a drink or something. And she's like, "What about you, Charlie Sr.?" And he said, "Well, I don't drink." And she said, "Nonsense. I never met an Irishman who didn't drink." So she made him a little Manhattan. So after that, he was part of the Manhattan Club. There's pictures of me with my grandfather. I don't obviously remember him. The only vague memory I have is we were over there for dinner one night. I can still remember this, but he must have been dying because I just remember him being upstairs. And so 1962, 63. So Dad didn't have many stories about him except indirect stories. And then grandmother, she went to Europe for a religious retreat. She traveled with Dad. There's a lot of stories about that. Grandmother had, according to Dad, 4 or 5 miscarriages, other than just he was their only surviving son. So you imagine this was probably a pretty tight knit, and you have this picture, if you take all these jigsaw puzzles, of Charlie as a guy who was just reliable and responsible and dependable and the person you'd want in your corner in a tough time. And those things were my father and they're me. So that's why I subtitled this, The Beginning of the Value System. I wish I knew more about my grandfather, because I imagine it took a certain kind of energy to start a business and fight your way through it and be successful. I just wish maybe he'd gone into the truck business, and then I wouldn't be in a machine shop in Hanover. That's my grandfather.